It begins, as many tragedies do, with a question whispered more than asked. What happens when the pursuit of truth collides with the machinery of power? Every generation inherits its own forbidden stories, not myths, but moments that slip between official lines. Behind closed boardrooms and encrypted servers, behind the glass walls of laboratories and the polite quiet of university corridors, some people glimpse too much. They see how numbers bend, how influence circulates, how secrets become currency. And sometimes those people do not live to tell what they found. Across decades and continents, a pattern flickers like static through history. A philanthropist found lifeless in a mansion. A programmer in exile, silenced before he could release a file. A journalist who swore he was being watched, then vanished in fire and metal. 10, 20, perhaps 100 stories repeating the same rhythm. A brief moment of revelation, then a sudden absence. But beneath the headlines and speculation lies something more ordinary and more human. Fear. Not the cinematic fear of assassins and conspiracies, but the quieter dread of those who sense that knowledge itself can make them a target. The line between enlightenment and danger has always been thin. Galileo crossed it. So did countless unnamed scientists, whistleblowers, and dreamers whose names never reached a screen or page. This series is not about villains and victims. It is about the tension between discovery and control, how the same intelligence that builds empires can also conceal what threatens them. We live in an age that worships transparency, yet the more data we gather, the deeper the shadows seem to grow. Perhaps that is the paradox of progress. Every new light reveals another place to hide. In the stories that follow, wealth is not the moral center. It is a magnifying glass. It enlarges everything: ambition, isolation, paranoia, courage. The men and women you will meet were brilliant, flawed, and often defiant. Some sought justice, others merely survival. Each believed, at least for a moment, that truth could protect them. They were wrong. Yet to dismiss them as casualties of intrigue is to miss the deeper question. What truth were they willing to risk everything for? Was it evidence of corruption or the conviction that ordinary citizens deserved to know? Was it an act of rebellion or simply conscience catching up to privilege? Every case leaves behind the same echo. Documents missing, testimony sealed, investigations quietly redirected. But the traces that remain tell us as much about our world as about them. We see institutions instinctively preserving stability over honesty, and societies more comfortable with tidy myths than messy realities. We see ourselves glancing away when a story feels too dangerous to believe. Perhaps that is why these deaths still haunt us. Not because we know what happened, but because we never truly will. Mystery is a mirror. It reflects both the limits of our knowledge and the boundaries we choose not to cross. In the chapters ahead, we will revisit 10 such mysteries, not to assign guilt, but to understand what they reveal about the fragile balance between curiosity and control. From laboratories in Toronto to desert prisons in Spain, from newsrooms to digital frontiers, each story forms a fragment of a larger mosaic. Humanity's endless negotiation with power. And as you listen, remember, this is not merely a catalog of deaths. It is a meditation on what it costs to ask questions the world isn't ready to answer. Because sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is simply to tell the truth. It began on a winter morning in Toronto, December 2017. The city was wrapped in its usual stillness, snow muffling traffic, light refracted in the cold air, when police were called to an elegant brick mansion on Old Colony Road. Inside, by the edge of an indoor pool, 2 figures sat side by side, lifeless. Barry and Honey Sherman, a husband and wife who had built one of Canada's greatest pharmaceutical empires, were gone. At first, authorities spoke carefully. Murder-suicide, they said, a tragic domestic episode. But the scene disagreed. Their wrists were bound. There were no signs of struggle, no farewell note. The posture of their bodies was identical, almost staged. A final tableau that refused to fit any easy story. To understand what happened, one must understand who Barry Sherman was. He was not a man who inherited power. He engineered it, molecule by molecule, patent by patent. His company, Apotex, grew into one of the largest producers of generic drugs in the world, offering medicines for a fraction of the cost demanded by brand-name giants. To some, he was a savior of accessibility. To others, a saboteur of profit. In the pharmaceutical industry, profit margins are not numbers, they are ecosystems of influence. Barry's insistence on breaking monopolies disrupted billions in corporate revenue. He challenged pricing cartels, sued regulators, testified against inflated costs. Behind polite smiles and business conferences, he earned enemies who spoke the language of strategy and retaliation. Honey Sherman was different, warm, grounded, deeply involved in charity work. She was the public grace that balanced Barry's relentless intellect. Friends described them as inseparable. Two people who had built not just a company, but a shared moral compass, medicine as a public good. Weeks before their deaths, Barry had prepared documents for an upcoming parliamentary hearing. Evidence, colleagues said, of price manipulation at the highest levels. He had spoken of exposing the hidden handshake between pharmaceutical lobbyists and government officials. And then, without warning, that voice went silent. The case that followed became a study in institutional discomfort. Police shifted from homicide to financial crimes. Surveillance footage vanished. Autopsy reports were sealed. Theories multiplied, each circling the same void where answers should have been. But perhaps the most haunting question wasn't who killed the Shermans, it was why. What is the value of truth in a system where information itself is currency? Maybe the Shermans' death wasn't just about pharmaceutical secrets, but about something deeper, a warning written in absence. In their silence, an entire debate disappeared. The moral question of how much a human life should cost, and who decides that price. Barry once said in an interview, "If medicine is meant to heal, then greed is the disease we have yet to cure." Those words, now archival, carry a weight they never did before. Their mansion remains, its pool water still and reflective, like a mirror waiting for meaning. Investigations continue, families grieve, and the industry moves on. Yet the echo persists, low and unresolved, in boardrooms and courtrooms across the world. When the people who make our medicines die mysteriously, what does that say about the health of the system itself? It began, as many scandals do, with wealth that seemed untouchable. Jeffrey Epstein was the kind of man who appeared everywhere and nowhere at once. A financier without a fund, a philanthropist without a cause, a name that drifted through corridors of power like perfume after someone has left the room. When news broke on August 10, 2019, that he had been found dead in a Manhattan jail cell, the world reacted with disbelief that bordered on déjà vu. Another impossible ending. The official cause was suicide. The details refused to cooperate. Cameras failed. Guards slept. The cellmate vanished. A dozen small coincidences folded neatly into one convenient conclusion. For decades, Epstein had built a network that blurred the lines between privilege and predation. His homes, from Palm Beach to the Caribbean, were not simply mansions, but stages. Behind the illusion of luxury parties and philanthropic dinners, something else had taken root. A system of control, manipulation, and blackmail, refined with surgical precision. It was not just about crime. It was about power as performance. He collected people the way museums collect art: presidents, princes, scientists, celebrities. Each a portrait in his private gallery of influence. There were cameras in the walls, rumors of recordings, whispers of files too dangerous to see daylight. When Epstein was arrested again in 2019, the curtain trembled. For the first time, the machinery behind his wealth faced exposure. Federal prosecutors called it the largest case of human trafficking among the elite ever investigated. Epstein began to talk, or so his lawyers claimed. He offered information in exchange for protection, and then, just days later, he was gone. The reaction split the public into two worlds, those who saw conspiracy in every shadow, and those who saw only the exhaustion of a justice system too entangled with its own power. But perhaps both are true. That truth and corruption often coexist in the same space, indistinguishable until it's too late. The autopsy revealed fractures in the neck more typical of strangulation than hanging. Files disappeared. Investigations stalled. And within hours of his death, the properties that once hosted the most powerful people on Earth were raided, their contents sealed under the banner of national security. To this day, no one knows exactly what those rooms contained. Perhaps evidence of crimes, perhaps nothing at all. Yet the mystery persists because it speaks to something older than Epstein himself, a fear that the world is ruled by circles so tight that even justice cannot enter. But to reduce it all to conspiracy is to miss the deeper tragedy. It is not just that Epstein's victims lost their chance to face him. It is that society lost its chance to confront what his story revealed. That power, when left unchecked, feeds on silence. The more unimaginable a truth becomes, the safer it is for those who shape it. Maybe that is the true legacy of the financier of shadows. He showed us how the system protects itself, not with bullets or secrets, but with disbelief. In the end, his death left behind a question that echoes far beyond prison walls. When every witness to corruption is erased and every record locked away, what happens to the truth that remains unseen? He once said, half joking, half serious, "The only thing I trust is the code I write myself." John McAfee was a man who built walls for others, digital ones. The antivirus pioneer who became a fugitive philosopher, a millionaire in exile, a voice that blurred the line between paranoia and prophecy. He spent his final years insisting that he was being watched, that governments and corporations were conspiring to erase the few remaining freedoms left in the digital age. And then, in June 2021, inside a prison cell in Spain, he was found dead. Hours earlier, a court had approved his extradition to the United States. The timing was too neat, the narrative too rehearsed. Officials called it suicide. His followers called it silencing. But the story of John McAfee began long before the cell, long before the headlines. It began in a cluttered home office in the 1980s, where he wrote the code that would protect millions of computers from invisible threats. He saw what others didn't, that the new battleground of the modern world would not be fought with soldiers, but with information. The irony, of course, was that the man who built software to guard against viruses spent his life trying to outrun a more complex infection, the fear of control. In his later years, McAfee became a digital wanderer, a self-styled revolutionary. He claimed to possess files that could expose global surveillance programs and financial manipulation. He spoke of a dead man's switch, data that would automatically release if he died unexpectedly. The details were hazy, the tone theatrical, but beneath the chaos lay a genuine conviction that privacy was the final frontier of freedom. When his servers went offline the moment news of his death broke, many believed the switch had been neutralized before it could activate. His followers saw it as proof of conspiracy. His critics saw it as the final performance of a man who could never stop scripting his own mythology. To study McAfee's life is to study contradiction itself, the visionary who saw too far, the narcissist who couldn't look away from his reflection. He was a man obsessed with the truth, yet perpetually surrounded by rumor. He built a career on uncovering hidden code, and in the end became one himself, an encrypted message the world is still trying to decode. What is certain is that McAfee was right about one thing: information is power, and power is never shared freely. He warned that our devices, our habits, our conversations were being recorded not for safety, but for control, a digital panopticon disguised as convenience. Years later, we find his warnings less eccentric than prophetic. Every app, every keystroke, every flicker of light on a screen now feeds a machine that knows more about us than we know about ourselves. So perhaps the question isn't whether McAfee was silenced. Perhaps it's whether we were listening while he spoke. In the end, his story isn't about a man versus the government or truth versus conspiracy. It's about a deeper struggle between transparency and privacy, between freedom and fear. John McAfee once imagined a world where the individual could vanish at will, free from the gaze of institutions. Instead, he vanished himself and left behind a digital ghost still whispering through the servers he once built. And as his words echo through the static of modern surveillance, we are left to ask, in a world where every secret can be traced, who will dare to keep the truth unencrypted? She was not famous, not until she became inconvenient. Dr. Brandy Vaughan. Bourgeois Vaughan had once believed in the system she later challenged. A pharmaceutical executive turned advocate, she began as a believer in medicine's promise, the faith that science and ethics move together. But over time, that faith cracked. What she saw inside the machinery of modern healthcare didn't match the ideals she had been taught. And when she began to speak, her voice carried further than anyone expected. In December 2020, she was found dead in her California home, 47 years old, a mother, a campaigner for transparency in medical research. Authorities said it was natural causes. Her friends said it wasn't. Vaughan's life had become an uneasy dialogue between conviction and fear. She had worked for a major pharmaceutical firm, selling, marketing, learning how profit shapes prescription. What began as admiration for innovation turned to doubt as she read internal reports suggesting that data could be adjusted, that numbers could be softened until side effects became invisible. She left the industry. But she didn't leave quietly. Through her organization, Learn the Risk, she began to ask questions the public rarely heard. About transparency, about the relationship between safety trials and shareholder expectations, about what happens when scientific curiosity must compete with quarterly profit. She spoke at community halls, on small podcasts, in university forums. Her tone was not radical, just insistent. We cannot make informed choices, she said, if the information itself is filtered. And then came the warnings, the break-ins where nothing was stolen, the feeling of being followed. Anonymous letters slipped under her door. She documented it all, as if she already knew how her story might end. If anything happens to me, she told her followers, it won't be an accident. When she died, her website disappeared within days. Her videos were flagged as misinformation and removed. Her research files, months of work, were erased from online archives. Official statements offered condolences. Unofficial ones offered silence. But beyond the speculation and fear, her story remains a portrait of a deeper human conflict, the cost of conscience. She was not trying to overthrow an empire, she was trying to understand one. She did not seek to prove that medicine was evil, only that accountability was necessary. What made her dangerous was not her claims, but her questions. In an age of endless information, real courage often looks less like shouting and more like asking, clearly, calmly, persistently. It is the act of slowing the current, of forcing the world to pause and think. That kind of courage rarely makes headlines. It simply disappears when it's no longer convenient. Perhaps Brandy Vaughan's greatest legacy isn't in what she revealed, but in what she represented. A reminder that institutions, no matter how advanced, remain human and therefore fallible. We live in an era that rewards certainty, but progress is born of doubt. To question is not to betray science. it is to protect it. Her death left behind a child, a community, and an unfinished conversation, one that now belongs to all of us. And so her story ends where it began. A single voice asking softly but relentlessly, what are we willing to ignore in the name of trust? He had worn every kind of badge: West Point graduate, Pentagon advisor, White House consultant. To colleagues, John Wheeler III embodied the quiet confidence of a man who had spent a lifetime serving his country. Which is why, when his body was found in a Delaware landfill on the last day of 2010, no one knew what to make of it. The coroner's report listed blunt force trauma. The police called it a mystery. Those who knew him simply called it impossible. Wheeler had spent decades inside the corridors of power. His expertise was national security, logistics, defense contracting, the invisible architecture of government spending. He understood how money moved through the system, and more importantly, how it sometimes disappeared. In the final months of his life, colleagues noticed a change. He spoke of irregularities, contracts that didn't add up, accounts that led to nowhere, billions routed through anonymous entities with no clear purpose. Follow the numbers, he told a friend. That's where the truth lives. Then came the paranoia. He said his computer was being accessed remotely, that he was being followed. And then, abruptly, he vanished. The timeline is fractured, like an erased recording. Security footage captured him wandering through a parking garage, disoriented, clutching one shoe. His movements seemed erratic, but his friends insisted he was not a man prone to breakdowns. Something had happened in those missing hours. Days later, sanitation workers discovered his body among the refuse of a city he had helped govern. No explanation, no motive, no clear path between the life he'd lived and the place he was found. The simplest stories are often the least convincing. Police suggested confusion, an accident, but others saw the familiar pattern, an inconvenient truth, a man preparing to expose it, and a silence that arrived just in time. If Wheeler had truly uncovered a scheme, billions funneled through offshore accounts, defense contractors colluding with banks, it would not have been the first of its kind. But it might have been one of the few with someone credible enough to make the evidence matter. What makes his story haunting isn't only the mystery of his death, but the intimacy of his conflict. Wheeler was not an outsider railing against corruption. He was an insider torn by it. He believed in the system. He helped build it. And when he began to see its fractures, he tried to mend them, not destroy them. But truth inside bureaucracy moves slowly, and often not at all. When his case was quietly closed, his file sealed, and his investigation forgotten, what remained was a question that lingers far beyond one man's tragedy. Can integrity survive in a structure built to protect itself? Perhaps Wheeler's death isn't about conspiracy or cover-up, but about what happens when loyalty meets conscience. Every system relies on men and women who will follow orders, until one of them decides to follow the truth instead. And when that happens, history repeats a familiar rhythm: confusion, denial, disappearance. Somewhere in an archived folder, locked under the label National Security, the documents he gathered may still exist. Perhaps no one will ever see them. Perhaps that's the point. But as the landfill was cleared and the headlines faded, one image remained: a man who gave his life to the machinery of government and was consumed by it. He knew too much, or maybe he simply knew too well how power protects itself. He was 26 years old and already a legend in code. Aaron Swartz didn't just help build the internet. He believed in what it could become: a vast open library, a public square for human knowledge. A system that belonged to everyone, not a few. On a gray morning in January 20, he was found dead in his Brooklyn apartment. The police called it suicide. The world called it a tragedy. His friends called it a warning. Aaron had always been more philosopher than programmer. At 14, he helped design RSS, the tool that lets information travel freely across the web. At 19, he co-founded Reddit, then walked away from its profit to chase something larger: access. He wanted a world where knowledge was not locked behind corporate paywalls or academic fees. He believed that information, once shared, could become the great equalizer. But idealism is a dangerous currency in a world run by those who own information. In 2010, Aaron downloaded millions of academic papers from JSTOR, a digital archive. His goal was not theft, but liberation, to make research funded by the public available to the public. The U.S. government saw something else: a threat to authority in the age of data. Federal prosecutors charged him with multiple felonies. If convicted, he faced decades in prison for downloading knowledge. Friends say the case broke him, but others believe it was the weight of betrayal, that the same digital world he had helped to build had turned into a system of surveillance, monetization, and control. While companies harvested user data, Aaron fought for transparency. He saw how the architecture of the Internet, once designed for connection, had become a network of observation. He wrote, "There's no justice in following unjust laws." It wasn't a manifesto. It was a reminder that progress depends on those willing to disobey when obedience becomes complicity. In the weeks before his death, Aaron was preparing a presentation about government corporate data sharing programs. The same patterns later exposed by Edward Snowden were already in his notes. His laptop was seized after his death. The files were never released. The tragedy of Aaron Swartz is not only that a brilliant mind was lost too soon, but that his ideals were quietly absorbed by the very systems he challenged. Today, information flows more freely than ever. But so does surveillance. Knowledge is everywhere, yet access is still gated by algorithms and profit. Aaron once said that information is a form of power, and like all power, it must be shared. But sharing requires courage. It requires people willing to confront the invisible boundaries that define what we are allowed to know. He never sought wealth or fame. He sought fairness, a word that rarely fits into law or politics, but lives in conscience. When he died, the online world reacted with a strange mix of grief and recognition. Millions felt that a piece of the early Internet, that naive, hopeful vision of openness, had died with him. And yet his dream persists. Every time someone questions who owns our data, who profits from our attention, or who decides what truth is visible, his echo returns. Aaron Swartz believed that knowledge should set us free. Instead, it showed us how deeply we are bound. He should have been remembered as a pioneer of the digital age. Instead, Gary Kildall became one of its mysteries. In July 1994, the 52-year-old computer scientist, a man who helped invent the software foundations of personal computing, was found dead after what police called a fall. But the people who knew him best said that explanation fell apart as quickly as it was offered. To understand Kildall's story, you have to go back to the earliest days of the personal computer revolution. Before Microsoft, before Apple's dominance, there was Kildall, the quiet genius who created CP/M, the first operating system that allowed ordinary people to interact with a machine. He had, for a brief moment, the future in his hands. When IBM came looking for an operating system for its new personal computer in 1980, it was Kildall they visited first. Legend says he missed the meeting. Reality says he hesitated to sign away control of his creation. IBM moved on, licensing a rival program from a small company called Microsoft. The rest is history. A history in which Kildall became a footnote instead of a founder. But he didn't fade into bitterness. He turned his attention to something else, something bigger. By the 1990s, Kildall was working on what he called intelligent energy systems. Software that could allow neighborhoods, even individual homes, to trade and distribute renewable power without centralized control. It was a radical idea for its time. an energy internet, decades before the term existed. If successful, his technology could have upended the global energy market. Power companies, oil giants, and utility monopolies all could have found themselves bypassed by local networks of self-sustaining users. Energy independence for ordinary people, profit loss for everyone else. Then, one evening in Monterey, California, that vision ended. Witnesses said there was an argument in a bar, a scuffle, and that Kildall struck his head. He was taken to the hospital and died shortly afterward. But others described men in suits following him. Others said the injuries didn't match a simple fall. And within days, his research lab was broken into, all of his computers stolen, his files erased. Officially, the theft was never solved. Unofficially, no one looked too hard. Was it coincidence? Perhaps. But what unsettles those who revisit his story is the precision, the way the data vanished, the timing, the issue, the efficiency. As if erasing a man's life's work could also erase the idea he stood for. In truth, Gary Kildall's death may not have been murder at all. It may have been something quieter, the suffocation of innovation by inertia and greed, the kind of death that happens not in alleys, but in boardrooms. He once wrote in a personal notebook, "Technology's greatest promise is liberation, but only if we share it." Today, as we talk about smart grids, decentralized energy, and renewable futures, we are rediscovering what he already imagined 30 years ago. The freedom to generate and exchange power, not just electricity, but agency itself. Perhaps his legacy isn't buried in those missing files. Perhaps it's alive in every solar panel, every community battery, every line of open-source code that refuses to belong to a single owner. Gary Kildall's story is not only about how one man died, it's about how easily the future can be delayed, not by lack of invention, but by the fear of change. Because in every age, there are those who build systems that empower, and those who profit from keeping the lights dim. He lived on deadlines, but his story outlived him. Michael Hastings was 33 years old, a journalist whose pen carried the voltage of truth. He didn't write around power. He wrote through it, with precision, impatience, and an unshakable sense that journalism's first loyalty was not to access, but to honesty. He died before dawn on June 18, 2013, when his Mercedes erupted into flames on a quiet Los Angeles street. The crash was so violent that pieces of the engine were found more than 100 feet away. Police called it an accident. Friends called it impossible. In the hours before his death, Hastings sent a final email to colleagues. "I'm on to a big story, and the FBI is interviewing my friends. I need to go off the radar for a bit." Then silence. To the public, Hastings was the reporter who brought down a general. His 2010 Rolling Stone profile of U.S. Commander Stanley McChrystal exposed the tension between military leadership and civilian oversight in Afghanistan and cost McChrystal his career. It also made Hastings a marked man within the establishment he had once covered from the inside. But the story he was working on before his death was different. It wasn't about one general or one war. It was about information warfare itself. The growing alliance between intelligence agencies, media organizations, and emerging digital tools designed to shape public perception. He had been investigating how narratives are managed, how governments, with the help of technology companies, could direct the flow of online conversation, amplify certain ideas, and silence others. It was, in many ways, a story ahead of its time. And then his car accelerated. Witnesses said it seemed to move on its own, a flash of red, a sound like thunder, and then fire. Some pointed out that modern vehicles can be hacked remotely, their systems overridden. Others dismissed it as speculation. But one fact lingered. Hastings had just told his editors that he feared being followed. The FBI denied any investigation. The story he was working on was never published. In life, Hastings was a journalist of contradictions, cynical but idealistic, abrasive but deeply principled. He believed that journalism should make the powerful uncomfortable. He believed that information was oxygen and the public was suffocating. In death, he became something else, a symbol of how fragile truth can be when it collides with power. His crash file remains one of those open American mysteries that resists resolution, not because it is unsolvable, but because the answers would ask too much of us. To truly investigate would require questioning the institutions we trust to tell us the truth. Maybe that's why the story ended when it did. Years later, his words still echo in journalism schools and newsrooms that have grown weary of confrontation. If you're afraid of losing access, you've already lost your purpose. It's easy to remember Hastings for his defiance, harder to remember that beneath the outrage was compassion. He believed that democracy, like journalism, dies not from censorship, but from exhaustion, when truth becomes too inconvenient to chase. On that summer night, as fire consumed his car and the city slept, one chapter of that chase ended. But the question he left behind still burns, quiet and unresolved. When truth moves faster than comfort, who dares to keep up? She was driving alone through the dark back roads of Oklahoma. The headlights carved a pale tunnel through the night, the kind of isolation that makes sound itself hesitate. Karen Silkwood was 38 years old, a chemical technician carrying a folder of documents she believed could change everything. Proof, she said, that a nuclear plant was hiding contamination, falsifying safety records, endangering its workers and its town. She never made it to the meeting. Her car was found crumpled against a concrete culvert. Papers that witnesses said she carried were gone. The official report said she fell asleep at the wheel. The people who knew her said she was wide awake. Before her name became legend, Karen was ordinary, bright, stubborn, and meticulous. She worked at the Kerr-McGee plutonium plant, a place where precision meant survival. The air shimmered faintly with invisible danger. Every touch, every breath carried the possibility of contamination. She joined the union not out of ideology, but necessity, to fight for better safety standards, to make sure no one else left the plant glowing under ultraviolet light. Then one day, she herself tested positive for plutonium. The contamination spread to her home, her kitchen, her clothes. It was as if the very substance she handled had turned against her. But instead of retreating, she investigated. What she found was a portrait of negligence, missing plutonium, falsified records, government inspectors who preferred not to see. Her notes, scribbled in urgency, spoke of equipment failures disguised as routine maintenance and regulatory shortcuts buried in paperwork. The deeper she looked, the less she recognized the company she worked for, and the more she understood the cost of asking questions. When she died that night in 1974, the documents she carried vanished as though they had never existed. The FBI found traces of plutonium in her car. Too much for mere coincidence. Her autopsy revealed contamination in her lungs and liver. Someone, somewhere, had ensured that her silence would be permanent. Yet Karen Silkwood's story refused to vanish with her. It became part of the growing public reckoning with nuclear energy, a symbol of how invisible power can shape the fate of ordinary people. The film Silkwood would later make her name known worldwide, but even Hollywood could not capture the quiet realism of her courage, a woman who simply refused to look away. She wasn't a crusader. She was a worker who decided that loyalty had limits. Her death stands as a reminder that whistleblowers do not emerge from privilege. They rise from necessity. They are the people who clean the labs, assemble the parts, run the numbers, until one day they realize the system they serve is built on compromise. Karen Silkwood paid the price of that realization with her life, but her ghost lingered long enough to force change. Regulations tightened, public awareness grew, and somewhere in the silence between corporate statements and congressional hearings, her question still hums like low radiation. Who guards the guardians? The answer, she seemed to know, is simple. We all must. Because sometimes the smallest voice in the room is the only one that remembers what safety really means. They found him in the water. A quiet river in North Carolina, early summer of 2015. Sunlight dappling the surface, current slow and indifferent. Dr. Jeff Bradstreet, a physician and autism researcher, had vanished 2 days earlier. When his body surfaced, the official story came quickly. Suicide. But for those who knew him, the story didn't flow so easily. Bradstreet had built a career on controversy, not because he sought it, but because he wouldn't stop asking the questions others avoided. He was a family doctor who became an investigator, driven by desperation after his own child was diagnosed with autism. He wanted to understand, to heal, to trace the unseen threads that link the body and the mind. In time, his curiosity led him to the edges of medical orthodoxy. He explored unconventional treatments, studied biochemical patterns, and questioned the ingredients and safety protocols of widely used vaccines. To some, he was a pioneer of integrative medicine. To others, a dangerous skeptic undermining public trust. In June 2015, federal agents raided his clinic in Georgia. They seized patient records, computers, and experimental data. Bradstreet told friends he was confident, even hopeful. He believed the raid was intimidation, that his work, controversial as it was, had threatened too many interests at once. Days later, he was gone. The river told no secrets. The autopsy said self-inflicted gunshot wound. The weapon, strangely, was never recovered. His family hired private investigators who pointed to inconsistencies, the trajectory of the bullet, the absence of gun residue, the missing firearm. But official silence is louder than any theory. The case was closed before the water even stilled. In the weeks that followed, his research disappeared from the internet. Websites shut down, archives deleted. His name was recast as a symbol of pseudoscience or martyrdom, depending on who was speaking. What was left was noise, polarized voices shouting across a void, while the man at the center of it all was no longer here to answer. But behind the headlines and speculation was something more human, a portrait of conviction tangled with isolation. Bradstreet's work was born from empathy, not rebellion. He wanted to understand suffering that modern medicine too often dismissed. And like so many before him, he underestimated how unforgiving systems can be when challenged. Maybe his death was exactly what it seemed. Maybe it wasn't. But the greater tragedy lies in what was lost with him, a conversation we still haven't learned how to have, about trust and authority, about innovation and oversight, about how fear and profit can shape the definition of acceptable science. Dr. Bradstreet once wrote that the hardest part of healing isn't the cure, it's convincing others that healing is possible. Those words, simple and sincere, may have captured the essence of his struggle. His story is not a verdict. It is a mirror held up to our collective discomfort, how quickly we silence what we don't understand, and how easily the pursuit of alternative answers becomes heresy in an age that prizes consensus. The river that carried his body away still moves, quiet and unchanged, reflecting a sky that forgets what it's seen. But every now and then, when sunlight touches the surface just right, it looks almost like memory, fleeting, shimmering, refusing to vanish entirely. And in that light, his question still ripples outward. How many truths drown simply because we stop listening before they surface? By now, the stories begin to sound familiar. Different names, different cities, different decades, yet each follows the same strange symmetry. A discovery, a warning, a silence. What connects a Canadian pharmaceutical magnate to a young internet idealist, a nuclear technician to a fugitive coder, a journalist to a doctor by a river? Nothing and everything. It is easy to see these stories as conspiracies, harder to see them as parables. Each life reflects a pattern as old as civilization. When truth threatens the machinery of power, it is not the system that changes. It is the truth-teller who disappears. But maybe disappearance isn't only physical. Sometimes it's reputational, a name turned toxic, a career rewritten in whispers. Sometimes it's intellectual, an idea buried under noise until it suffocates. And sometimes it's moral, the slow erosion of our collective courage to ask why. History rarely kills ideas outright. It just exhausts those who carry them. Across these stories, one begins to sense a rhythm of human contradiction. The same intelligence that invents cures also conceals them. The same networks that promise openness evolve into tools of surveillance. The same drive for truth becomes the spark of tragedy. We want progress without discomfort, revelation without risk. But progress doesn't work that way. It feeds on uncertainty. It demands the willingness to stand at the edge of what is known and to keep looking, even when the light hurts. The Shermans wanted medicine to be affordable. Epstein turned intimacy into leverage. McAfee built digital armor, then became a prisoner of his own code. Vaughn asked for transparency and found none. Wheeler uncovered corruption and was swallowed by the machine he served. Swartz fought for knowledge and was crushed by the law meant to protect it. Kildall dreamed of energy independence and vanished before it could be real. Hastings raced to expose invisible narratives and died in the fire of one. Silkwood carried evidence that disappeared with her. Bradstreet followed compassion into controversy and drowned in the aftermath. Each believed in their own way that truth had value. Each learned that value has a price. When you line their stories together, something unsettling happens. The personal becomes systemic. What looks like coincidence begins to resemble design. Not necessarily the design of a hidden cabal, but of a culture that instinctively protects its structures, financial, political, technological, from the friction of accountability. Power does not always need to conspire. It only needs to endure. And endurance often requires erasure. Yet even erasure leaves residue. There are always traces. A document, an idea, a memory carried forward by those who refuse to forget. In that sense, these 10 lives form more than a pattern. They form an echo chamber of conscience. And if you listen closely, the echoes don't accuse. They ask. They ask what truth means in an age where information can be manipulated as easily as erased. They ask what courage looks like when reputation is the first casualty. They ask whether progress still belongs to the curious or only to the careful. Maybe the question isn't why these people died. Maybe it's why their questions died with them. And maybe, just maybe, those questions are still waiting for an answer. Every mystery, when examined long enough, turns into a mirror. Not one that reflects the dead, but the living, the observers, the doubters, the ones who look and then look away. We tell ourselves that systems exist to protect us, governments to safeguard liberty, corporations to deliver innovation, media to keep us informed. But systems have instincts too, and their first instinct is not justice. It is survival. Across the stories we've seen, the scientists, the journalists, the visionaries, the inconvenient, the same law repeats itself. A structure built to preserve order will always resist those who challenge its foundation. Not through violence necessarily, but through discrediting, through delay, through quiet reclassification. Sometimes it's a press release. Sometimes it's a missing file. Sometimes it's just forgetting. This is how modern power protects itself, not by erasing truth, but by overwhelming it with noise, by turning complexity into confusion, by flooding the world with so many competing versions of reality that the average mind stops trying to distinguish them. And yet, in that blur, something vital is lost, our capacity for moral focus. When a truth becomes dangerous, it doesn't simply vanish. It mutates. It becomes rumor or myth or entertainment. The act of exposure becomes spectacle. The content of it, the human cost, the ethical weight, gets consumed by the performance. We turn whistleblowers into archetypes, then into hashtags, then into ghosts. We remember their names but not their lessons. There's a quiet tragedy in that. Because each of these people, in their own way, wasn't chasing conspiracy. They were chasing clarity. They wanted the world to make sense again, to see the machinery for what it was, flawed, human, and desperately in need of reform. But clarity threatens those who profit from complexity. To live ethically in an unethical system is to live in tension. To carry truth like a contraband item you can't quite declare at customs. Some decide to stay silent, others speak and pay the cost. In that sense, every institution is a mirror of our own moral thresholds. We like to believe we'd act differently, that we'd have the courage to expose corruption, to tell the truth no matter the cost. But courage is easy in theory. It's harder when it demands your livelihood, your safety, your place in the world. Perhaps that's why we need these stories. Not to confirm our cynicism, but to remind us that integrity is never abstract. It is always embodied in someone, somewhere, who chooses conscience over comfort. The system, in all its complexity, is not an enemy. It is a reflection of us, of what we tolerate, what we reward, and what we ignore. And the mirror never lies. What we see in it now is unsettling, a civilization drowning in data, yet starved for truth. A society fluent in outrage, but allergic to accountability. But mirrors have another purpose, too. They don't just reflect, they reveal. And in that reflection, maybe we catch a glimpse of something redeeming. The possibility that awareness, once seen, cannot be unseen. That every suppressed truth still carries the potential to awaken someone else. Because even in the quiet machinery of power, the human conscience remains, fragile, luminous, and for now, undefeated. In the end, it isn't the deaths that haunt us. It's the silence that follows them. When a voice vanishes, it leaves behind more than an unanswered question. It leaves a vacuum. And in that emptiness, meaning begins to echo. We fill it with speculation, fear, or faith, trying to make sense of what power refuses to explain. But silence, like gravity, has a pull of its own. The stories we've followed, the Shermans, Epstein, McAfee, Vaughn, Wheeler, Swartz, Kildall, Hastings, Silkwood, Bradstreet, were never just about what happened to them. They were about what happens to us when we witness the disappearance of those who try to speak. Because every vanished truth changes the world a little. It narrows our imagination. It makes us hesitate the next time we see something wrong. It teaches us, quietly and efficiently, that curiosity has consequences. And yet, history keeps finding its way back through the cracks. Each of these lives, in their own way, became a fragment of something larger, a slow, generational realization that truth cannot be owned. It may be delayed, buried, or distorted, but never fully destroyed. Sooner or later, it reemerges, carried by those who still believe in the simple, radical act of asking why. Perhaps that is the true legacy of these stories, not martyrdom, but momentum. The understanding that progress depends on discomfort, that knowledge demands risk. That truth is not a weapon, but a responsibility. In an age where information travels faster than reflection, it's easy to mistake awareness for understanding. We scroll, we share, we forget. But understanding is slower. It requires stillness, the willingness to sit with contradiction, to see the world not as we wish it to be, but as it is. The men and women we've met across these chapters each reached that stillness in their own way. They faced the moment when silence would have been safer, and spoke anyway. That, perhaps, is what makes their stories enduring. The tragedy is not that they died, it's that their courage has become entertainment, Their warnings background noise in a culture that moves too fast to listen, but maybe that's where hope begins again, in the remembering. Because remembering is a form of resistance. Every time we tell their stories without sensationalism, without hysteria. Simply, honestly, as human lives shaped by moral tension, we reclaim a little of what was lost. There's a line from a philosopher who once wrote, "Truth does not die when it is murdered. It dies when it is forgotten." And so we remember. Not because it will bring justice, but because it reminds us of the fragile thread that connects conscience to courage. Because the moment we stop asking questions, the machinery of indifference begins to hum again. Look closely at these stories, and you'll see they were never about billionaires or scandals or secret files. They were about something smaller and infinitely greater, the ordinary human desire to make sense of the world, even when the world refuses to explain itself. So let this be where the silence ends. Not with certainty, not with accusation, but with awareness. That truth, though often unspoken, is still alive in every mind that dares to seek it. And perhaps that is all that has ever kept civilization from collapsing entirely. The stubborn, enduring belief that even in the darkest rooms of power, someone, somewhere, is still looking for the light.